Hope everyone's conference is going well so far. Welcome to this session on forming a worker cooperative farm and worker-owned cooperative farm. Really excited for this session, and I hope you are too. Your mics are off, and your video can be on or off, your choice. We are recording today, and this session will be available on the conference app and eventually on the Field Network website. We also hope to send out a PDF of the slides from today, as well as some additional resources. My name is Matt Gordon. I am the Education Director with Rogue Farm Corps, a nonprofit in Oregon that hosts beginning farmer training programs. And I will be playing tech host today and facilitating the Q&A session. This session is part of the Field Network track as part of this conference. And we have a lot of other cool sessions that you can check out as part of that track. That's part of the incubator and apprenticeship national networks. We want to thank our sponsors for this session. Farm Credit, our longtime supporter of the Field Network, who's generally sponsoring this year's Field School track. And in addition, we'd like to thank our session sponsor, Organic Valley, for their generous support of this year's conference. Please take a minute to visit them at their exhibitor booth during the conference to say hi when you get a chance. We also have an exhibitor booth. The Field Network has an exhibitor booth. I'm actually going to be there right after this session. So come by and say hi there as well. I'd like to invite you all to type into the chat as a little introduction, where are you located? And if you're a member of any cooperative, to type in the name of that cooperative. So again, where are you located? And if you're a member of a cooperative, what is the name of it? I'm assuming everyone has some familiarity with Zoom. If not, the chat is usually on the bottom panel. There's a little chat button. And you can chat to everyone, which is great. Looks like everyone's got that. We've got people typing in where they're from. That's great. And again, if you have a cooperative that you're part of, please type it in. While we're doing this, I'm also going to launch a little poll. We get to know who's here a little bit and give you a minute to answer that and put in the chat where you are. So if you're a farmer or rancher or agricultural service provider or associated with a university or other, and then is this your first introduction to cooperatives is the second question there. And looks like about half of you have voted. And a lot of folks from the East Coast, a few from further out west. I'm in Portland, Oregon. Our presenters today are on the West Coast as well. I'm going to introduce them here in a minute as soon as this poll is closed. So again, if you would vote in the poll there, then we'll get going. I'll go ahead and introduce our presenters actually while people are still polling. Really excited to have both Gianna Banducci and Narendra Varma here with us today to talk about forming a worker-owned farm cooperative. Gianna Banducci has spent 9 years as a cooperative owner, developer, board member, and consultant. Her experience has centered around food and agriculture co-ops within California and Oregon. Her current role is a cooperative development specialist at the California Center for Cooperative Development. Gianna supports entrepreneurs with resources and training to launch and grow worker, consumer, and producer co-ops within the food and ag sectors. Narendra Varma is the executive director of Our Table Cooperative in Sherwood, Oregon. Narendra was born and raised in India and came to the United States in 1986 to attend Brown University. After graduating, he went to work at Microsoft Corporation. Since leaving Microsoft in 1998, Narendra developed a passion for food and agricultural issues, land stewardship, community, local investing, and permaculture. In 2010, Narendra and his wife, Michelle, relocated to Portland, Oregon to combine these interests and put them into practice. They formed Our Table Cooperative, which strives to create a model community scale food system by bringing together all stakeholders in the food value chain from farm to table as members of a single vertically integrated organization. And I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here. If you haven't voted, sorry, we're just going to cut it off. Looks like, well, people are still coming into the session, so I'm going to leave it open for a minute, and I'll keep doing our intro things here. Today, Gianna's going to start with how to form a worker cooperative, and then Narendra will follow with perspectives from our table cooperative and thoughts and stories from that experience of starting and being a part of a worker-owned cooperative farm. And after that, we'll have plenty of time for questions. I do want to encourage you to put questions in the chat box throughout today's session, so that when we get to the question and answer session, we already have a bunch of questions lined up, and we should have a bunch of time for questions at the end if everything goes as planned. So with that, I'm going to end this poll here and see if I can share the results. I don't know if you all can see that. Hopefully you can. Of kind of a good mix of farmers, ranchers, service providers, university folks, and other. About maybe a third of folks, this is the first introduction to cooperatives. So thanks for filling that out. I'm going to invite Gianna to share her screen and kick us off.
Thanks for that intro, Matt. I'm just going to get everything set up here. There we go. Okay. Hello. With everything happening right now, I'm really grateful to be in this space with you all talking about the opportunities that co-ops hold. I wanted to take a moment specifically to really shout out our frontline farmers, ranchers, and food system workers before I jump in. You know, these definitely are incredibly challenging and at times can be frightening moments. And so I just wanted to express gratitude for the way our food system folks continue to show up and demonstrate that commitment and courage to keep our communities fed and nourished. As Matt said, my name is Gianna, and I am a development specialist at the California Center for Cooperative Development. CCCD, as we call ourselves, is located in Northern California and one of a handful of state co-op development centers across the country that provide technical assistance, education, and resources directly to co-ops and the general public. So I'm going to walk you through some of the basics of starting a worker co-op farm today and outline some broad steps for the launch. So let's begin with what a worker co-op is. A worker co-op is a business that is owned and democratically controlled by the workers. They're commonly formed based on a desire by a group of people to have greater economic independence over their job, over their employment. Also, there's an interest to have shared risk and reward in a business, as well as there tends to be a kind of overwhelming commitment to a larger community impact. So something that cooperatives are very well known for and very skilled at is circulating capital within a community economy. So key characteristics of worker co-ops is that they establish their own wage structures. They govern their business based on a shared decision-making structure. Workers also both handle operations and kind of overall strategy for the business. And then lastly, workers are also committed to contributing equitably via capital contributions to not only starting the business, but also maintaining it. I did want to call out one common misconception about co-ops. Some folks tend to understand them to be nonprofits. Co-ops are very much similar to traditional businesses in which they do require a profit to remain viable. They pay taxes. So they do operate as we know many other businesses to do. Co-ops of the worker nature tend to be started in one of two ways. They are launched either as kind of a completely new business, or they are converted from an existing business, which we'll get into more detail on a little bit later. I wanted to take a moment to call out the 7 international cooperative principles, mainly so that you know that they exist and kind of represent a unifying thread among the cooperative space. They're established by the International Cooperative Alliance of co-op leaders from around the world, and exist mainly to kind of guide the operations, the strategy, and the impact of co-ops, kind of bringing us all into a similar values system. So I'm not going to go through them one by one, but again, just mostly wanted to put them in front of you so that you know that they're kind of a grounding, unifying element of being part of a cooperative ecosystem. We're going to move into discussing benefits and responsibilities of co-op membership. So first and foremost, by allowing for equitable participation of each member, the common saying in co-ops is one member, one vote. So what that equates to is that each member, by contributing equitably to the business, then has a voice in the mission, in the direction, and in the impact of that organization. Another kind of key benefit of co-ops is that folks who join will share in the risks and rewards of doing business together. Co-ops will pool resources and labor to share in the running of the business together, taking on whatever challenges, opportunities, kind of accomplishments then come out of that business. This can overall lead to greater resilience in an organization, as you ideally have more people and resources to support the operation of that entity. Another benefit is that as a member of a co-op, you would share in any profit earned by that business. You know, after all costs are accounted for and any necessary reserves are held for that business, then the remaining profit is allocated to member owners, in this case, worker owners, and returned over time as what's known as a patronage refund based on the number of hours each member worked. Members of worker co-ops are also able to elect and serve on the board of directors. This allows owners to contribute to kind of that overall big picture of the organization. They are either selecting people to kind of represent the whole of the group through the board, or they're participating directly in the board themselves. And then lastly, co-ops provide for sovereignty of labor. So members of worker co-ops have ownership over their labor, preventing non-members from extracting benefits from their contributions. So by sharing in the profit, worker owners of a co-op then are directly able to derive value from their work, which is definitely different from what we see in more traditional businesses. Now, on the flip side, to kind of balance those benefits, there's always a set of responsibilities associated with being a member of a worker co-op. First, as folks come into the organization, there are a certain set of eligibility requirements to become a member during what's called a candidacy period. So these requirements are typically outlined in co-op policy, and they often pertain to how long you've been employed at the organization and your performance and kind of things of that nature. The waiting period before becoming a member really allows both the co-op and the individual to evaluate whether the other is a fit. Narendra, who you'll hear from momentarily, always kind of uses the analogy of it's a dating period. So it's the time for each entity, the person and the individual, to spend time getting to know each other and understand kind of the inner workings, and then ultimately land on that decision about whether they're going to make that full commitment of having that member then or that individual buy into the business. Related to this, folks will also need to maintain ongoing requirements of membership, typically associated with maintaining a certain number of hours worked, as well as other related criteria. Once folks are voted in as a member, they are required to invest in a membership share at a specified amount. So it's quite literally your tangible investment in the organization. The amount of this investment will vary by co-op, really catering to the membership that it's serving. And it can often be structured where it's paid over time through paycheck deductions, since it can be somewhat prohibitive to have that full membership payment ready up front. Lastly, in terms of responsibility, another important consideration is that members need to contribute capital when necessary. So not only at the point of joining the co-op, as I just mentioned, but also if occasion arises over time of operating the business, such as the co-op experiences financial turmoil and needs additional capital to stay afloat, or if the capital alternatively is looking to expand or make some type of improvement, the co-op has it within its means to go to its membership and seek that additional funding in order to achieve those objectives. So let's move into the first of the two ways to start a worker co-op, which is to launch an entirely new business. Now, much of what I set forth is going to be aligned with general guidance around starting any other type of business. You know, you'll want to assess your feasibility, create your projections, define your vision. You'll just notice that in some of what I share, there's some co-op related considerations to them. First, you're going to want to identify your core group of founding members. You know, you need to have your engaged group of potential owners from the start to conduct that research, to plan, to implement the framework of your co-op. If you have a larger group of worker owners that are interested to launch the business together, you may want to empower a smaller group or a steering committee to kind of tackle this early work together and then report back or share kind of proposed ideas with the larger group. Within this group, you're going to want to also define your shared needs and values and goals among the members. You know, it's really important to outline this from the start so that you know that you're on the same page together. Part of the premise of the co-op is that you're meeting shared needs. So ensuring that you're aligned on this from the beginning really can lay a strong groundwork for the organization as you get off the ground and create that common culture. Along these lines, you're also going to want to develop that vision and mission for your business. So answering that question of what are you looking to bring into the world and how will your co-op specifically contribute to that? Next, you are also going to want to frame your business concept and revenue model, beginning to look at how you will make money, specifically what is the product or experience that you're going to be offering through your co-op, how is it going to get to market? And lastly, kind of as part of this consideration of the group that's coming together, you're going to want to assess those skills and expertise that you have in your midst. As you move into later phases of development, it's going to be helpful to know what folks are already kind of capable of contributing to and what help you might need to bring in, such as legal or financial expertise. So next, we're going to move into assessing feasibility. So there's a variety of kind of elements associated with this phase of development. You're going to want to conduct your research to ensure that there's a market for your business. Now that you have that concept defined from what we just discussed a moment ago, are there folks out there to whom that you can sell and deliver your product? You'll want to essentially research that there's a viable market with what you're sharing in the world. You're also going to want to spend some time examining the various entity options for structuring your co-op. We're going to go into detail on this more in the next slide. But based on the co-op corporation statutes for your state, as well as other entity formation laws, it's important to explore the structure options that allow you to kind of meet the goals of your business and also operate as you want. This is where those financial pro formas come into play. You know, when you're in this feasibility stage, you're going to want to demonstrate that the assumptions you're making about your co-op are in fact financially viable. So consider starting to formulate those kind of key or core financial documents, your P&L statement, your balance sheet, your cash flow statement, looking out somewhere around 3 years. And then lastly, as I probably don't even need to say to this group, but if you are starting a worker co-op farm, land access and associated capital is a fundamental element of that experience. So starting to formulate the avenues for accessing your land, you know, who are the folks in your ecosystem, those support organizations that will help you not only research but go through the process of getting land, as well as the financing that you'll need to support that endeavor, and bring in any necessary equipment and materials. So the most common entity structures for co-ops are either a co-op corporation or an LLC. With co-ops, with LLCs being most common among worker co-op farms. You know, co-op corporations, as they stand, have the premise of co-ops embedded within their legal structure. So all that to say that they require the business to be member owned and operated, they require profits to be returned to members, and the services or products produced by the co-op must directly benefit the membership. Whereas with LLCs, they're more of an adaptable model that can be modified to really suit a co-op structure, and also come with an associated limited liability, obviously. Now, both of these structures are pass-through tax entities, meaning that the individuals who own the entities are directly taxed on profits, whereas the businesses are not. So that's kind of one of the benefits that we commonly share around the co-op structure. So as I mentioned a moment ago, before evaluating entity options, it's really important to begin by examining the regulations in your state around co-op corporation statutes, LLCs, as well as other structures you may be considering to understand what's allowed and what is required of these specific entity options. I've included a few key considerations for choosing between these two structures. First, what I mean by employee versus partner is that in an LLC, partners or owners are not considered employees. Thus, you are not subject to certain employment laws like minimum wage requirements, whereas in a co-op corporation, employment law applies. So folks who are starting a farm where cash flow is often tight, if they're not able to meet minimum wage requirements for themselves, then the co-op corporation structure might not suit that group. Related to this, in terms of workers' compensation in an LLC, there isn't a requirement to secure workers' comp because owners are not treated as employees. Now, this serves a benefit of lowering, you know, those costs for the business. However, it does create that additional risk, which is not ideal should any incident come up where workers' comp would be needed. If it's not in place, then the individual or the business is taking that on directly themselves to handle. So not something that we necessarily recommend to not have that workers' compensation, but it does serve to lower costs that could potentially inhibit the organization. Lastly, in an LLC, people get paid out of owner draws. So there's no actually wages paid out, which makes it possible for someone who's a foreigner to be paid from the entity. So I share this consideration because it's one way to support undocumented folks in terms of participating in co-ops. Again, there's no employment law requirements in an LLC such that folks who are undocumented are able to benefit and derive profit from the organization. Now, dependent on the entities you select, I wanted to outline as well the key organizational documents, which differ slightly. In a co-op corporation, you're filing your articles of incorporation to then launch the actual entity. After that, within your organization, you'll create bylaws as well as a membership application and agreement. Your bylaws kind of serve as your internal policy. They're your shared ground rules that speak to how folks become members, how folks leave the business, how the board works, how profit is distributed. So very much kind of a guiding document. In an LLC, similarly, you'll need to file your articles to incorporate your business, but the common approach is a bit more simplified in that the operating agreement serves as kind of a one-stop shop for bylaws and the membership agreement, such that when folks are joining the co-op, they will need to review and sign just the operating agreement. So as we kind of move forward in creating our co-op, we get to the stage of actual setup, of actual launch. Here's where you would develop your business plan. Much of the planning and research that we've already discussed in the previous slides now gets compiled into the information in this document, which not only benefits the purposes of the folks in the group, but can serve to meet lender or financing requirements as well. It's time to give yourself a name. And if you are incorporating specifically as a cooperative, again, this is where you're going to want to refer to your state co-op statute to understand about the requirement of it including cooperative in the name, which tends to be the case if you're going that route. But in general, you're definitely going to want to confirm with the Secretary of State that your name is not already being used. You're also going to want to be preparing your organizational documents that we just discussed on the previous slide. This step, along with incorporating with the Secretary of State, are phases of this process where you might want to consider seeking out legal counsel or technical assistance from a state co-op development center if there's one in your area, or possibly a small business development center, because they can assist you in really addressing these key documents and ensuring that you're meeting certain requirements, as well as providing potential templates for you to use. And then from here, you incorporate. You'll file with the Secretary of State and pay that filing fee. And related to this, there's also a kind of secondary requirement, you could say, of filing what's known as a statement of information, if folks aren't already familiar with the Secretary of State. Again, this is dependent on your state, but the statement of information is typically required to be submitted within 90 days of creating your co-op or creating your business entity. It identifies your board directors, your business address, and your agent for service of process. In general, the statement of information is an annual requirement of the state, where you'll need to file it to reflect any changes or updates to that information, or alternatively just reflect that nothing's new. So now you celebrated your moment becoming a co-op, you've incorporated, you're in existence. And so these are a few things that you'll now do to kick off your organization. You will hold your first board of directors meeting. First, you would elect that board amongst your group. And then in that first meeting, you would adopt the organizational documents that we discussed. You would elect your officers and then possibly approve the establishment of your bank account, which means that you could then go out and open that account and begin to set up your co-op accounting system. You would also want to confirm your founding members and sign membership agreements. Again, this depends on your entity structure. If you're a co-op corporation, you would distribute membership applications and accompanying materials for folks to then complete and submit to the co-op for approval. And once approved by the board, then member candidates, as we call them, would sign the formal membership agreement and pay their capital contribution to become a full-fledged member. In an LLC, as I discussed a few minutes ago, you would go the route of having folks sign your operating agreement representing entry into the organization. Lastly, you would begin wanting to consider your governance structure, so how you will make decisions essentially as a group. It's really important to spend some time kind of learning your governance option, discussing what's important among your group, setting up and testing various structures as well, if that's a possibility for you all. Now, in the resources list that I share at the end, you'll note that I refer to a Greenhorns guide for cooperative farming. In this guide, they have a very comprehensive list of various options of governance structures, which I would suggest referring to and reviewing as your group evaluates, the various paths that you might pursue. In general, we found that most groups in defining what constitutes a majority vote will look beyond 51%, as they're aiming to ensure that a majority of the group is really on board with decisions and directions of the organization. I had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation around conversions. And so wanted to identify that a growing trend in the co-op space is conversions from small businesses primarily. We're seeing this particularly as owners retire and look to identify a succession plan that keeps their business operating, serving both the community and their employees. A couple different ways that conversions typically occur. Either an owner is selling to their employees and remains with the business or leaves the business. Secondarily, the owner converts to a worker co-op and then brings in new people to be founding members. The one caveat here is that we haven't seen conversions to be as prominent in agricultural yet. They definitely occur across a lot of other various industries, but it just hasn't been as common in ag yet. Not to say that it's not possible, and maybe it'll be your group that actually starts to kind of build the frequency of this. I did want to share a couple important considerations around conversions. First, a business must be financially stable. Switching to a co-op is not a solution for a failing business. As I said at the beginning, co-ops need to be profitable. They need to maintain viability in order to survive. So in fact, if an owner wanted to convert to a co-op and the business is failing, then it burdens those new owners as they seek to get off the ground as a collective. Secondarily, it's important to have an engaged group of potential future worker owners in order to facilitate a conversion. So many months, even years before a conversion will occur, the existing owner of the business will begin kind of assessing interest among their employees of converting to a worker co-op. They will engage those employees in greater responsibilities, share more transparency of the business in order to really facilitate a successful transition to a worker co-op. I wanted to share some insights to debunk some kind of preconceived notions about how a worker co-op might serve. First, a worker co-op is not a silver bullet to land access. Although the premise of a co-op is to pool resources based on land prices in the US, it still remains difficult to access land, even as a group with these shared resources. Lots of times the capital needs to get land may be so high that it's still too much once you've brought together all your resources as a group. What the co-op structure may offer you is more hands to do the work of searching and accessing land, as well as it might broaden your network of being able to connect with folks that either can support you in getting land, or maybe have a specific referral to a land opportunity. However, we've rarely seen kind of the co-op format result in greater access to land from a capital standpoint. A co-op is also not a quicker, easy solution to launching and running a farm. So similar to the amount of time it might take to, say, build soil health, it can take a while to nurture a culture for working together in a co-op. In the US, we do not have a dominant culture of cooperation. So thus, when individuals come together to share in the ownership of a business, especially folks that might have previously not been an entrepreneur before, can really take a while to integrate as a group, understand your governance structure, figure out how you work together. It's definitely somewhat of a radical endeavor to collectivize and to approach business ownership from a group standpoint. So all this to say, I would really encourage folks to not underestimate the time, the understanding and additional work required to launch a cooperative entity. Co-op is also not a way to ensure that all farmers participate equally in the business. Co-ops establish a landscape for democracy to flourish, but it's not required. In other words, a co-op structure really can't force people to participate in the running of a business. People, as we know, will show up in different ways in terms of being a member, bringing their own kind of talents and skills and bandwidths. And the co-op structure can't force anybody to become anything that they're already not. Over time, it might create a new collective culture of working together. Ideally, that's what it does. But from an individual standpoint, it can't change somebody's approach necessarily. Lastly, a co-op is not a way to pick and choose what responsibilities you want to take on as co-owner of a business. Some folks have a notion that being part of a co-op means that you can choose what you want to do and what you don't want to do since you're an owner. And in fact, that's not the case. You are a co-owner, and you have to figure out how to work synergistically with those other folks in your business. You'll need to compromise. You'll need to serve the best interests of not just yourself. So as Narendra has also mentioned and will likely speak to more, being your own boss is actually a smaller part of the business than actually operating the business. We tend to put more time and effort into actual operations than we get to put toward being a boss. Before I wrap up, I wanted to share a couple of case studies of worker co-op farms that I've worked with in California. They're kind of more familiar type of approach to worker co-op farms, whereas Narendra's will be sharing kind of the more unique example of our table momentarily. So first is Flying V Farm. Now they're a worker co-op with 2 members currently located in Northern California. They formed it as an LLC and have that associated operating agreement in play. They previously launched with 4 worker owners, but over the course of a couple of years, they had 2 of those owners depart. And so this in and of itself really highlights the kind of a challenge and opportunity of the co-op structure through this staffing shortage. A loss of any workers in ag can be really difficult, but it gets especially difficult if those folks are owners of the business, sharing in certain responsibilities and also bringing that necessary capital. It represents a lot to replace people and also to nurture people that are coming into the business as potential new owners. Also in smaller groups, the loss of worker owners can really impact the dynamic of that business. So that's somewhat of a challenge then in being a smaller worker co-op. At the same time, you are still creating ownership opportunities for farmers, which can sometimes be hard to come by. I did want to mention another kind of highlight from Flying V's story, in that they do represent somewhat of an innovation in the market. They partner with local food co-ops on kind of a variety of endeavors. Specifically, one of them is that they're launching a regional apple variety, which I think previously went away. So in that, there's a certain benefit for them in selling to co-ops, which speaks to one of the principles of co-ops that I showed you earlier, that being cooperation among co-ops. But what we've seen is that in these relationships between worker co-op farms and consumer food co-ops, there's benefits from better pricing, mission alignment, also kind of a certain degree of creativity and collaboration that can take place. And then there's similar customer bases such that, you know, folks that Flying V would sell to directly, they can also reach through the actual food co-op. Next, I wanted to jump to Cloverleaf Farm. So they are a small operation. They have orchard crops and some row crops as well, operating out of the Sacramento area. They initiated as a partnership by 3 farmers and had an ambition to transition into a worker co-op LLC, but unfortunately they had some struggles getting there. So for them, the challenge was around really engaging folks to become fellow owners of the business while running up against the capital contribution required for folks to become co-op members. So this group of farmers identified that for prospective worker owners, the buy-in wasn't necessarily accessible. So they started allowing non-members to benefit from membership benefits specifically. So what that meant is they allowed non-members to participate in certain decisions, in sharing in the profits to a certain degree, without having to contribute that capital to the organization. And so what it started to do was blur the lines between member and non-member, such that folks really didn't have to commit to the co-op and they could still gain from the benefits of the co-op. While there is a lot of kind of difficulty around the reality of the capital contribution, what happened here is that it ended up setting a precedent for the organization of not having to be a member and still reap the member benefits. And that in turn kind of not only impacted the foundation of the business, but it also influenced the longevity of folks to stay with the business. You know, the ground rules that I've talked about that are developed through co-op policies, specifically bylaws, really serve to not only keep all of the existing owners on the same page and kind of create a pathway for new folks to join the organization, but it also allows the organization to evolve and kind of still hold its structure. So lastly, I wanted to wrap up by leaving you with some outlets should you be interested to learn more about worker co-op farms. First, the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. It's a national membership organization that supports worker co-ops across all sectors. I would specifically recommend attending one of their monthly calls about how to start a worker co-op if you're interested to learn more. Additionally, if you were to become a member of their organization, they offer a worker co-op farm network, which includes monthly calls in the off season, bringing together worker co-op farms from across the country. And also there's in general a listserv that exists among this network such that worker co-op farm members are, you know, chiming in to ask questions and you know, share findings and such. Additionally, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives is a nonprofit cooperative association of Black farmers, landowners, and cooperatives based in the South that really supports Black farmers in accessing land and keeping land, as well as connecting them with training and support services in ag. The State Co-op Development Center's link is a map, actually. And I would suggest checking out the map to figure out if there is a state co-op development center in your area. Unfortunately, there is not one in each state. I can share as well, like in the Northwest, for example, their co-op development center actually serves Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. But a good starting place to kind of search for technical assistance providers in your region. Additionally, the National Co-op Resource Map is another option, which kind of goes a step further than the state co-op development centers map, in that it includes some of the state co-op development centers, but it also incorporates other co-op partner organizations like co-op lenders and legal support. And then lastly, I wanted to link to that Greenhorns guidebook that I previously mentioned. It's really a phenomenal resource that breaks down a lot of the elements that I've shared into more detail, and can kind of provide a roadmap for you in terms of how to start a worker co-op farm. So with that, I am going to pass it off to Narendra to speak to you specifically about our table.
Great, thank you, Gianna. So can you guys see my slides?
I see your slide, but there's sort of a dark box over the right-hand portion of it, Narendra.
Okay.
There, now it's better.
Okay. Why can I not? Hold on a second. Okay. So my name is Narendra. I'm the founder of Our Table Cooperative. We're located just outside of Portland, Oregon, in sort of at the kind of edge of suburbia and a more rural landscape. We formed our co-op in 2013, and I'll give you a little bit of just about sort of some of the background. We started off initially as a farm incubator, very typical to other farm incubators in the nation. But we very quickly, within the first year, ran into a number of problems which led us down the co-op path. Some of these I'm trying to summarize here is that really just that the idea of an incubator where there's a whole lot of little, maybe usually new startup farms or food businesses that are sharing some kind of resource, whether it's land or tractors or whatever else it is, are essentially trying to exist within little silos and potentially even compete with each other sometimes. And really what we found with the incubator model is that when you're a startup, the pressures to kind of succeed rapidly, pay off your startup costs, et cetera, maybe even pay some of your bills, are so high that a lot of those kinds of goals tend to kind of be misaligned with the goals of sort of longer term thinking, which sustainable farming requires. We also found that people constantly complained of sort of loneliness and stress of solo entrepreneurship. And all of this essentially made itself very, we kind of felt it really more because of a lack of commons management. So all those shared resources that the incubator was trying to provide and that the community of people sharing them was supposed to kind of care for and share, we really found that there was a lot of negative incentive to use those resources in a way that benefited me, but didn't really necessarily benefit the rest of the group. So it really was a commons management problem failure at some level. We kind of, as a result, stepped back a little bit and went, whoa, okay, what's happening over here and how do we fix this? And we realized that, farmers historically have always really formed a lot of cooperatives. I mean, most cooperatives in the world are around farming and agriculture because, as you all know, there are a lot of risks in farming. A single bad year can be an existential risk. It can put you out of business. But even in good years, there's a huge amount of money to go around. So the rewards tend to be small, the risks tend to be existential. So the idea of collectivizing risk in exchange for also collectivizing the rewards is very practical, I think, in agriculture. And that's partly, I believe, why farmers have always formed co-ops. We also sort of looked at the broader issues around food, especially sort of local food and realized that there were systemic problems that needed systemic solutions. So taking a systems design approach, we kind of started with values, which I'll get to in a second. But really what we did is flip the script to ask this question of what is the economic and cultural model that you would need to create in order to support a broader vision for local, sustainable, community scale food. Okay. So a little bit about those values. This is sort of very consumer facing in our little grocery store on the farm. But it sort of tells you that, at a very high level, at that 10,000 foot level, the most important thing being, fresh, delicious food that's high nutritional content, high value, high quality of product. Geographically, we source everything from within Oregon, so there's a geographical component to our values. Honesty is really kind of similar to kind of transparency, really ensuring that everything is transparent, that information is shared, not only about the food itself, but just about the organization. We are rooted in personal and cooperative relationships because we really feel that community is the key here. There's a stewardship concept or component around not just the way land is managed, but also the way we treat animals and people, especially. And I really like the words grace and humility here because they really kind of speak to the kind of stewardship that I'm talking about. And then all of it is really tied together with a commitment and passion and love. So starting with those very high level values, we kind of came up with a structure for community scale food system owned by the community. And it has multiple elements. So we have a farm that I'll show you in a second, a 58-acre farm outside of Portland, where we grow a variety of mixed vegetables and fruit. Obviously, we can't grow everything that our community wants to eat. So we also have 12 other regional food producers, which are independent farms and food producing organizations that are independent businesses but belong to our co-op. All of that is then aggregated at our facility on the farm where we have cold storage and distribution infrastructure. We have a commercial kitchen on site that does some processing, and then also a full grocery store on site, although a lot of the end customer retail is done via either things like CSA or farmers markets, or even some of the farm's output or this aggregated output ends up going into other wholesale channels like restaurants and other grocers. And then eventually consumers, which is really all of us, get to buy and eat this food. So the question we said is that, okay, in this kind of community scale food system, how do we get every single person involved? Okay, from the farmer to the bookkeeper, to the delivery driver, to the retail store clerk, to you sitting at home in your kitchen, preparing the food and eating it, all to be co-owners and all to have a seat at the table. And we came up with this model of a multi-stakeholder cooperative, which are a little bit rare entities in the US anyway, with 3 groups of membership. Okay, so far John has been talking about worker co-ops. Many of you in your surveys and chat mentioned that you're members of food co-ops or other consumer co-ops, where and really we as at our table are a merger of all 3 kinds of co-ops. A worker co-op, which means all of our staff are member owners. A producer co-op, which is all of these regional producers, okay, coming together to sell their food through a cooperative. And a consumer co-op, which is all of these folks buying the food and actually eating it. Okay, so that's our structure. A little bit of just to show you where we are and put it in context. This is an aerial view of the farm. Can you see my pointer over here? Pointing at things.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's actually our grocery store right here. The access road right over there. And our pack out shed and a few other facilities, so you kind of see how that all looks. The farm itself, as I said, is about 58 acres. We actively farm about 25 acres. This is some of our crew. All of these folks are worker members. Not everybody employed by the co-op is a worker member, and I'll get to that in a second. Our retail store is a full service, full diet, sourced organic grocery store. The idea is that you should be able to eat everything you need to eat or want to eat, sourced from the local geography, with some exceptions like coffee and things like that, but all organically grown or sustainably grown. So it's really full diet, local organic. About 85% of the products we carry are Oregon sourced, and about 90% are certified organic or equivalent. Okay, so it's pretty unique. Now, obviously, it's a small space, so it's highly curated. You can't go into an aisle and find 50 brands of potato chips and be confused about which one to buy. We picked a couple which meet our sourcing guidelines. Okay. It's really all about relationships and not transactions. And I think this is true for co-ops in general. This is what we're really trying to push forward, is a business entity that's still very much a for-profit business entity, but that is really trying to build upon relationships between workers, producers, eaters, and this the community at large. Our overarching goal is to build community through food. And this is just a picture of one of an event, an Earth Day event or something like that, where we serve some food, hot food for people. And it's just really indicative of what we're trying to build. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we've learned. I think when we look at what are the positives of worker co-ops, or just in our case, a multi-stakeholder co-op, and really, even though we are a multi-stakeholder co-op, on a day-to-day basis, it's us workers who are involved, every single moment of every single working day. So we tend to kind of take center stage at some level. And really, the main thing is the community aspects, even amongst us as workers. That kind of loneliness of entrepreneurship is a long past. We definitely work together. I'm personally always surprised by how people are willing to step up to the plate. We recently had our bookkeeper leave because she wanted to take a different job somewhere else. And we thought, well, hiring a new bookkeeper in the middle of COVID, that's difficult to find and interview. And somebody who was an existing worker at the farm of one of our farmers, and actually also does our deliveries for us, stepped up and said, oh, I'm really interested in learning more about this. And, we trained him up, and now he's doing our bookkeeping. Okay, so there's a great opportunity for people to kind of grow and change roles. And really, it's all about that shared risk and reward, and we see that a lot. So those are really the things that are great. But as Gianna mentioned, our cultural patterns are not fundamentally cooperative, and cooperatives are pretty radical democratic organizations. It's one member, one vote. We are not used to that at all. All other business entities in the US, okay, are designed with the premise that money equals power. If you bring $51 to the table and I bring $49 to the table, you are in charge, period. Okay. Now you can have an operating agreement in an LLC that says that decisions have to be made by, a super majority or whatever. But if it ends up in court, 51% is always going to win. Okay. There are maybe exceptions to that if your lawyers wrote a really airtight operating agreement. But generally speaking, the premise is that money equals power. The thing that differentiates co-op structures by design and definition from anything else is that money does not equal power. One member, one vote, period. There are no ifs, ands, and buts, and that is written in statute, okay? So although, as Gianna mentioned, you can create any kind of fancy cooperative structure with an LLC structure, LLC, and then have a complex operating agreement around it. The fact is that if your state happens to have co-op statutes that meet your needs, I highly recommend going that route, because your LLC operating structure then is not trying to recreate statute in its operating agreement. And if there's a dispute, instead of challenging that operating agreement, which is far easier to challenge for the disputing parties, whoever has an issue would have to challenge actual state statute, which is obviously a much higher bar. Okay, so legally speaking, if you agree with the co-op principles and you're trying to form a co-op, then I would highly recommend that you try and actually form a co-op and not go the LLC route. Now, your lawyer might tell you otherwise, but keep your mind open. A lot of times lawyers tell you that because they have no experience with co-ops. Most corporate lawyers, it's very easy to find somebody who has a ton of experience with LLCs, and they tend to default to that because that's what they know. It doesn't mean that your state doesn't have an appropriate co-op statute that might be a better fit for you. So you really have to kind of do your homework and decide, okay? Governance is absolutely critical, is something that we've learned. We kind of knew it intellectually, but when you actually learn it from experience, it really comes home. So speaking about governance a little bit, shared control always sounds good on paper, but as we know from even our own personal relationships, it's hard to even decide who's going to wash the dishes in a household, let alone, how to run a business with other people, right? So, remember that you are entering into relationship with your co-owners. It's no different than if you said, I'm going to take 20 people and own a business together with them. That is what you're doing. think about how difficult it is to even have partnerships to operate a business with 2 people, then try and expand that to 20. It gets exponentially more complex, which is why co-ops tend to have more formal governance procedures in place to allow there to be a framework within which that decision making can exist, and people don't feel like they were, steamrolled or left out or any of that kind of stuff. So the structure and the formality of a governance model really helps to put things in place, okay, and to ensure that everybody's voice is heard and that disputes don't occur. Now, obviously, people need to feel a sense of agency over their day-to-day decisions, but they also need to feel a sense of belonging and meaning around the values and goals of the organization, so that everybody can kind of keep an eye on the bigger prize and feel a sense of agency on their day-to-day. We at our table use a governance model called dynamic governance or sociocracy, which has one very salient feature, which is that number one, it believes in hierarchy. Okay, we're not trying to be consensus. I personally do not believe in consensus decision making. I don't think it's very practical or efficient, especially as groups get larger in size. But with dynamic governance, there's a concept of hierarchy of domain and a hierarchy of power. And dynamic governance, unlike most other governance models, keeps those very distinct and separate. Just to explain this a little bit, if you're the general of an army, you look at the broadest domain, okay, compared to, let's say, the foot soldier, and you have the most power as well. Most corporate entities in America run the same way, okay? The CEO has the broadest domain and the most power. In dynamic governance, those 2 things are separated, okay? So, for example, I'm the executive director of our table. In the hierarchy, I'm at the top in terms of domain. So I get to look across the organization and kind of make sure that everything is working with everything else. Within the next tier of domain, so let's say the farm or the retail space, the people in charge of that and the people working in that have full day-to-day responsibilities and power. I do not get involved and tell them what to grow, how to grow it, when to do it, or any of that, okay? And again, you don't need dynamic governance to do this. There's other governance models that people try and use to kind of push that power downwards, okay? But really, the separation of domain and power is critical for our governance models. However, it does require the domain to be broad enough for everyone to have a sense of ownership of something. So if all we're doing is growing carrots, and there's 5 of us, and that's all we do, we're probably going to argue a lot about how to grow the best carrot, okay? Because there's just not enough decision-making to go around. It makes more sense in your organization than to have a single person making some of the decisions. There's nothing inherent in co-op structures that say that you have to have fancy governance methods or consensus or anything. You can be a traditional hierarchical organization if you wish to be, okay? Comings and goings is sort of my way of talking about members who come and go. Gianna spoke about a case study of a co-op that essentially failed because people couldn't figure it out. Or there were certain things that happened, and then her previous case study was about a co-op that started with 4 members and went down to 2 and is now trying to build up again. So let's talk a little bit about this kind of how do members come and go. In our case, and this is quite common, I think, in a lot of worker co-ops as well, there's a 1-year dating period, okay? When you join our co-op, we employ you. You are an employee. You start as an employee. We put out a job description because we're looking for a certain set of skills, just like any other organization. We interview you, we hire you. The first year is considered a sort of a trial period or a dating period, really, because we're getting to know each other before we go get married, okay? Like with marriage, divorce is possible, but it's painful. So what we've learned over the years is that it's really important to be selective, okay? And the smaller your group, as you all know, the faster any given individual in the group becomes kind of operationally critical. So it becomes really difficult, especially if you've been working with somebody for a year, to go like, okay, now we don't want that person around anymore because, gosh, they were doing all this work. And if we get rid of them, somebody else has to do all this work and we don't have somebody. So, just be careful that it's very easy to fall into the trap of, but they're so important that we have to keep them. Okay, just like in any other situation where you've got somebody who's not working out and isn't a good fit, don't accept members for a co-op who aren't a great fit, because having to get rid of a member in a co-op is much harder than just firing an employee, okay? Some people aren't a good fit, Okay, and in fact, what we found is that some of the most hardworking and dedicated and skilled people are the poorest fit. Why do I say that? Because most of those people tend to be control freaks. Okay, and control freaks don't work well in a cooperative way. Now, we are in a culture that really encourages individual control freaks and rewards them. So we tend to kind of create a lot of these people too. We don't really, we're not a culture that encourages cooperation from a young age. So people don't learn the skills. So it's really, it's a cultural education process that we all have to go through. It's kind of like a reprogramming, okay? And I will say, I mean, in our case, in order to have somebody leave, the membership and the board has to vote to divorce with this person, okay? And there is an appeals process that the person can go through. And I'm not talking about, you know, if somebody is stealing or otherwise, you know, egregiously violating the terms, then that obviously that's much simpler. But we're talking about where it's really just the relationship isn't working, the fit isn't working, the working environment isn't positive. And I will say that every time we've voted somebody out, it's been painful. And that's why I call it divorce, but every divorce has made us more successful and happier. I don't know if that's true for people with multiple marriages and divorces, but it's true for us, okay? And okay, so just the key to success for us, our vision is a resilient and interdependent food culture. And I always like to leave presentations with a quote from a man named Lord Northbourne, who wrote that we have tried to control nature by force and by intellect. It now remains for us to try the way of love. And the way of love really is what we're trying to do in terms of how we grow and distribute and eat our food and prepare our food. And it's also the way we're trying to exist as a community of workers and co-op members. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Narendra and Gianna, both, for all of that. That was awesome. We're going to switch over to Q&A now, and let's see if I can remove your spotlight, Narendra, so anyone can be spotlighted here. And feel free to turn your video on and put questions in the chat box, and we'll start here with some of these earlier questions. Why a cooperative and not a multi-member LLC? Pros and cons of those structures. I don't know if either of you would like to speak a little bit more to that.
I can jump in on this. First, I would say to refer to that Greenhorn's Guide Cooperative Farming resource that I shared at the end of my presentation, as it goes into detail on the various structures, specifically multi-member LLCs versus co-op corporation. In general, if you were to go the route of forming a multi-farm LLC, you would likely be looking for more flexibility than state co-op statutes allow. For example, in an multi-farm, LLC, you could have as little members as you like, whereas in a co-op corporation, again, owing to the statute, which is dependent on your state, there might be a minimum number of members required. Additionally, you may want more flexible profit sharing, because in a co-op, each member is treated equally. Whereas in a multi-farm LLC, you may want to structure your profit sharing with some degree of modification that associates to how each person brought capital to the multi-farm LLC.
Great, thank you. Here's a question. If I want to provide the land and some materials up front and then have farmers work the land and manage sales in exchange for a profit share, could this co-op model or worker co-op model somehow work with that idea? If either of you have any thoughts on that, or any other suggestions that's not a worker co-op model for this person? And as I'm asking your question, feel free, if I get it wrong or you want to add something to it, to turn on your mic and do that.
Just taking a minute to process this question.
Well, I can jump in. I would say no. Because if all you're really looking for is a profit share for your employees, then I don't think you need to incorporate it as a co-op. Because the idea with a co-op is you're really giving your employees an equal seat at the table. So if it's all about, making sure that they have a share of profits, I think there's a dozen other ways to do that are perhaps a lot simpler. Now, a co-op structure might suit your purposes because you have other goals in mind, in which case that's fine.
Great, thank you. I had a question here about capital contributions. If you mentioned, Gianna, like a co-op can seek additional capital from members, is there a requirement that members then contribute if the co-op has decided, hey, we need more capital from our members?
Yes, there is a requirement there. Just like Narendra said, a co-op establishes a premise of an equal seat at the table. Thus, that comes with an equal capital contribution, which is typically, in terms of joining the organization, will be outlined in those membership eligibility requirements and what it takes to then move from candidate to member. And then if the moment comes up as the organization is operational, where additional capital is needed, then everybody, by being in the organization, has committed to servicing those capital needs.
Okay. The next question is about immigration status of cooperative members. Is there any resources that either of you could point to regarding that? And Lucia, feel free to jump in and turn your mic on and ask more details if you'd like.
The U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops is a hugely solid overall kind of resource around not only setting up a co-op that is a worker structure in general, but also addressing various needs of folks that might be forming that co-op. So folks, based on Lucia's question, who might have uncertain immigration status, they will be able to provide resources in both English and Spanish around kind of, considerations or elements that may come up for folks who are looking to establish a co-op.
Also, I wanted to ask you, Gianna, is there also any other presentations? I know you mentioned a monthly meeting, I think through the U.S. Federation organization, but I was wondering if there's any information or any presentations regarding co-ops in Spanish.
Yes, the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops has resources in both English and Spanish, and I believe those monthly like introductory calls to worker co-ops or to starting a worker co-op are offered in both English and Spanish as well. The other thing I would say too, somebody brought up this organization in the chat, which is an awesome one, and I didn't include in my resource list, but COFED is another national organization that's supporting BIPOC and queer folks in terms of launching co-ops. I don't recall if they're just limited to the worker co-op space, but I know they are supporting the cooperative sector at large. So they might also have additional resources to kind of provide more information around setting up a worker co-op. I know Jennifer was the one who dropped that into the chat. So Jennifer, if you have anything more to add about their organization, please feel free to share.
Thank you.
Great. I just had a call yesterday with their ED, and she was really excited because they're launching this mycelium network, mycelium, which I really like the name of. And so they're trying to connect with co-ops of all, backgrounds, farm co-ops, grocery stores, housing co-ops, kind of co-ops at large. So definitely reach out to them to find out more. And yeah, they're really eager to network and collaborate with anyone who is interested and excited in co-ops. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Jennifer.
Great, thanks for all the questions. And just a reminder, feel free to turn on your video. We like seeing your faces, seeing everyone who's here if you want. Any examples of livestock farms that are employee owned? and I assume also cooperative owned, but maybe just employee owned.
I saw this question come through. It's a good one. I don't immediately have any worker co-op farms coming to mind that are purely focused on livestock. I think the worker co-ops I know are doing kind of a lot of mixed production, right? So they might be doing veg production and have also some chickens that they're raising. Narendra, do you know of any?
Not specifically to livestock.
Yeah, I think again, I go back to the worker co-op farm network that I mentioned through the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops that specifically focuses on worker co-op farms. I feel like there might be one or two folks in that group that might be trying to launch livestock focused worker co-op farms, but I don't recall in any with any certainty right now.
Anyone else in the session know of any examples? Livestock focused farms that are cooperative based or employee owned? Okay, well, we'll keep looking around for those. Let's see. What about financing? There are a couple, I think, curiosities around financing for cooperatives around land access or any specific financing sources that are either focused on cooperatives or maybe have some hesitancy around working with cooperatives. Any ideas around cooperative financing?
So this is where it kind of, for me, gets a little bit tricky around co-ops. So ag co-ops and credit unions in general are one of the oldest forms of cooperatives in the country. Particularly, they have longstanding origins among Black communities in the South. So a lot of ag service organizations, or I think ag lenders, are familiar with the cooperative structure, but it can still kind of get finicky when it comes to applying for funds, which Narendra, I was thinking of that experience you shared recently where the lender, and you can go into more detail, but the lender was requiring every member to submit like their social security number or tax return. So if you're not a small organization, it becomes very prohibitive. The one other thing I would say before turning it over to Narendra is that unfortunately, the co-op space is still growing such that there aren't too many co-op focused funding opportunities. I'm going to share a couple, but in general, co-ops tend to pursue a lot of similar funding within the ag or small business space that any traditional business would go after. Specifically within co-ops, there are a couple of organizations. The Cooperative Development Foundation is one national organization that's associated with the National Cooperative Business Association. And CDF, as it's known, can provide emergency grants for co-ops. They were especially active this year around supporting co-ops that were potentially threatened by business loss owing to COVID. An additional organization is called Shared Capital Cooperative. Now they are formatted as a cooperative and are specifically lending to co-ops across the country. Their loan amounts vary. I'm not sure how much they really support kind of smaller farms per se, but I know they've done a lot of large scale loans to food co-ops, for example, to support their expansions and other cooperative entities that are looking to, to continue their growth. Narendra, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think producer co-ops are very common in the ag space. So even traditional lenders, banks, et cetera, are used to that kind of an entity. Worker co-ops are a little more unique or different. So maybe it takes a little bit of educating. But one thing to remember is that for every kind of private sector entity that looks at you as a co-op and goes, what the heck is this? There is, for example, things like USDA co-op development grants. So there's a number of government programs that are specifically designed for co-ops. Similarly, if you apply for a farmers market promotion program grant or a local food promotion program grant, which are pretty common, or even value-added producer grants from the USDA, they give you extra points if you're a co-op, okay? And if you're specifically a co-op located in a rural area, and that's defined by the USDA in specific ways, then again, you get a lot of preferential treatment around a variety of co-op development funding that the USDA offers. So I would say that farm credit and FSA generally are not going to discriminate based on the fact that you're a co-op, but certainly private lenders might be a little, don't understand it. On the other hand, like Gianna pointed out, credit unions are cooperatives, and you can usually get them to at least listen to you.
Great, thank you. A question from Steph. Any advice for integrating gender equality in cooperative governance?
Do you want to speak to this, Narendra, in your experience?
Well, I'm not quite sure, Steph, what you mean. I mean, certainly, I don't think there's anything specific to gender when you're thinking about equality in governance, at least in my experience. I think we're going for, a cooperative is a fundamentally democratic organization. So really the task of the governance model becomes how to ensure that all those people who legally have a vote actually have a voice, because those are two different things, as we well know. So in our experience, over 50% of our staff is female. Have there been situations where men were, overshadowing the conversation? I'm sure they have. But I think over time, as our relationship has built with each other, hopefully that's become less of an issue.
I would say this has especially been a topic of prominence recently within the co-op space is equity in general. So not just gender, but racial as well. And sometimes there can be a misnomer within the co-op space that by having kind of democratic organizations, then that you are inherently subscribing to certain ideals of equity. And that doesn't play out in co-ops necessarily. So to what the question was, I think there is definitely a need within co-ops to focus on how to build greater equity amongst members. And that really comes about specifically through the group, right? I think you could embed certain principles of equity in your policy. You could, create value statements. You could think about how you structure your decision-making or kind of come together as a group around equitable principles as well. However, again, it really comes down to the group and to what you all are committing to, as opposed to kind of what's already inherent in the co-op structure. I think the co-op structure is a vessel for it, but just like we've seen at large right now, it takes us as individuals in realizing that equity within our organizational structures.
Let me add a little bit of that, not specific to gender, but because in our case, really the equity issues that we face generally are around language. So about 50% of our members, our worker members, are non-white, and about 40% are non-English native speakers. So really the big issues are not around cooperative culture, because we actually find that especially with first generation Latino immigrants, they generally grew up in societies that were more cooperative in nature. So they actually bring a unique understanding of cooperation to the table that they're not always able to vocalize, especially in English, but it's inherent. And on the flip side, sort of the college-educated white folks bring, a different set of skills to the table, but they also bring a lot of preconceived notions, which are usually wrong. Okay. So what we found is that kind of putting those two groups together and bridging the language barrier by having an interpreter at all, big meetings and things like that, and making sure the documents are translated, et cetera, allows our Latino workers to have a voice and use some of that inherent cultural experience that they have to really educate our American staff, really, at some level, our Native American staff. I mean, native born, I should say, sorry. Now, this has been a challenge because, of course, having an interpreter at every meeting is not easy. It's okay if you have somebody on staff who's bilingual, they can kind of translate for kind of ad hoc things. But in larger formal meetings, I highly advise spending the time and money on a formal interpreter, because it really does encourage participation a lot more than a person who's a peer doing the language translation, because it also gives that person a sort of a role of power that might disrupt the balance a little bit.
Thank you. Let's see, we have a few minutes left and a few questions left. I had a question. If it's possible to be an employee of a cooperative business as well as an owner member, and this is kind of a follow-up, Gianna, to something you mentioned about like in a co-op LLC, it sounded like you have to be either a member or an employee, but not both. Am I hearing that right?
So to get around workers' comp requirements and employment laws, if somebody wants to join the co-op and kind of go through a candidacy period, a lot of times the co-op will structure that situation such that the person is a partner from the start. So they will be limited in terms of decision-making power to a certain extent and the profit that they get. However, it allows the folks in the co-op to kind of circumvent those employment restrictions. So in some of these worker co-op setups as LLCs, employees altogether don't really exist. They keep people in kind of this category of partner in order to avoid a lot of what I've mentioned. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, I think it does. Narendra, your situation is a little different. It sounds like you have
in a actual worker co-op, everybody's an employee. Everybody gets workman's comp. Everybody gets is subject to employment law, including all of its protections. Which, in the LLC scenario, Gianna speaking about some of the benefits of sort of going around some of those things, but really, it all comes with a great deal of risk too, where people can be exploited. So, I mean, those employment laws exist for a reason. So, if you can achieve the same goals without the law, that's fine. But
it's not. So, are you saying yours is not an LLC, Narendra?
Oh no. We are very much a cooperative corporation incorporated under Oregon state cooperative statutes.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. I'm just scrolling through here and see if there are any other questions that I missed. Are there any other questions lingering out there that people would like to put in the chat or just unmute themselves and ask? We have time for maybe one more.
Somebody asked about royalty arrangements.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
I mean, certainly they're possible. We've done a royalty financing with somebody. So one thing I will say is, because I think the assumption or the implication has been that all the money, all the capital for the business has to come from the members. That is not the case. Just like if you and 3 other people were going to go off and start a small business, you might put up some seed capital, but then you might go to a bank or some other financing organization and get either equity capital or debt capital to finance the larger kind of aspects of your expenditure. Similarly, in a co-op, you can do exactly that too. You can go off to a bank or to other kind of financing organizations and raise capital. Now, obviously, debt is simple; it's just a loan. Okay, but when it comes to equity, co-ops do have the option of issuing preferred shares or equity stock, okay, that you can sell to investors, and those investors then get a dividend, just like they do if you own a share of GE or some other public company, but they do not have a vote. And this is what, again, separates co-ops from all other types of entities. It's a principle that's enshrined in co-op law. It's called capital subordination. And it means exactly that. Money doesn't equal power, remember. So even if you go off and you get equity investors that brought $100,000 to the table, and collectively your membership only brought $5,000 to the table because your buy-in was maybe $1,000 and there were 5 of you, that equity investor gets 0 votes, okay, on how the business is run. They cannot sit on the board of directors, nothing, right? They are preferred stockholders, as in they're first in line to get paid out when there's a profit share, or if your co-op dissolves and is sold or something like that. But they get no seat at the table when it comes to decision making, because it's a member-owned and member-controlled organization by law. I'm not sure you can actually do that in an LLC, but I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to that.
Great. Thanks, Narendra. thanks to both of you, Gianna and Narendra, so much for your expertise and your experience today. And thanks for all the great questions, and to all of you for joining us. And hope to see you in the other sessions and at the exhibitor booths. And have a great afternoon.